The mask modifier can be used as a method of selection for identifying areas of your geometry to edit further with other tools and modifiers. It can be also used as a means of hiding specific areas of your model. To access the mask modifier, go to the Modifiers tab in the Properties panel. Left click and then select the Add Modifier button. Go to the Generate section and come down to where it says Mask. Left click to add the mask modifier to your object. At first, it should appear as though the object's geometry has disappeared with the default settings. One of the tools that is most similar to the mask modifier in terms of its functionality is the Hide tool. This is a tool that can be used in both object mode and edit mode. To hide an object in object mode, just press the H key with that object selected. You can also use the eye icon in the outliner panel, like so. You can return an object to view, and in fact return all objects to view, by using the Alt-H hotkey. A better solution, however, is to use the eye icon, as if you were to hide multiple objects or have multiple objects hidden, and then use Alt-H, it would bring all of the objects back into view, even if you only wanted to restore one of them. Alternatively, we can also use the Hide tool in Edit mode. So go to Edit mode and then select the geometry that you want to hide. For example, this box has a lid and we're going to remove the lid, at least from our view. Select the geometry that you want to hide and press the H key. This will hide your selection. If you open up the operator panel, you can invert this to hide the unselected geometry instead. So how does the mask modifier differ from traditional hiding tool methods? Well, we're going to use a subdivided Suzanne as our first example, and we're going to re-add the mask modifier. Now, as soon as we do that, the geometry disappears. The reason why is because by default, the mask modifier tries to calculate a value for each individual vertex and face in between the values of 0 and 1. Anything that falls below a certain value is going to be hidden from view. Over in the Modifiers tab, we have two methods of masking, Vertex Groups and Armatures. Let's start with Vertex Groups. We can define what areas of our model are going to be masked using a vertex group. I'm just going to hide the effect of the mask modifier so that we can see everything. Then I'm going to go into edit mode, and from here I'm going to select some geometry to add to a vertex group. For example, let's just add the eyes. I've selected them by pressing the L key. Now I'm going to go to the Data tab in the Properties panel, add a new vertex group. I'm going to name it as Eyes, and then I'm going to click Assign. Now this geometry has been added to the vertex group labeled as Eyes. I'm going to return to the Mask modifier. I'm going to go back into Object mode. We'll turn on the visibility, and at the moment we can actually see that the object still works. So if we then choose the eyes option for our vertex group, now only the eyes are going to be displayed. If I was to untick this option, it simply shows the whole model. So as soon as we create a vertex group here, Blender allows us to view the model even when no vertex group is applied. Then when we add the vertex group, we will only be able to view the geometry within this group and everything else will be hidden. Note that beside the vertex group option, we have an icon here that allows us to invert what parts of our mesh are visible. For example, you can work on a single vertex group at a time by changing which vertex group is going to be a part of the mask modifier. But if you want to hide a specific vertex group to make modeling the rest of your object easier, just select this button here. It will appear blue, and on your model, your vertex groups will no longer be visible, but the rest of the object will. In our example, the eyes are no longer visible, but the rest of Suzanne is. Let's create another vertex group just so I can show you a use case for the mask modifier in terms of masking and hiding specific groups. We're going to go into edit mode once again, and this time I'm just going to select a vertex on the nose, press Ctrl+ multiple times, and the geometry here can act as the nose vertex group. So I'm going to return to the data tab, create a new vertex group, name it as nose, and then select assign. Now let's return to object mode, return to the mask modifier, and now I can left click and choose between the eyes vertex group and the nose vertex group. So if I swap to the nose vertex group, it's going to hide the nose, but the eyes will come back into view. And of course, you can add vertices to different vertex groups. So for example, you could create a third vertex group that had both the eyes and the nose as a single group, and then you could hide all of them at the same time. But this is not the be-all and end-all of using the mask modifier. In fact, the proper way to use the mask modifier with vertex groups is to control the weighting of individual vertices. For the moment, I'm just going to untick the vertex group that we had selected, and I'm going to create a third option. Now this time, I'm going to select all of my geometry for this example, create a new group, and I'm going to label it as all. Then I'm going to select assign. By the way, whenever we create a vertex group, you'll be able to define the weight value. By default, it's set to 1 for each vertex group that we create, but we can always manipulate this value and then click the assign button to change. For now though, I'm going to change my mode of operation within the 3D viewport from object mode to weight paint mode. When I do so, you're going to see that the entire model initially appears red. Now if we return to our mask modifier, we can click and select the all vertex group. If we do this, the entire model is going to disappear from view. If I click and drag on this threshold value at the bottom, it's only when we get to 1 that the object appears. This is because when working with weight painting, we can manipulate the threshold value to determine which vertices are going to be hidden and which are going to be visible. Because we created a vertex group and assigned all the vertices to a value of 1, it is only using a value of 1 with this threshold value that we are able to view the entirety of our model. But what happens if we were to paint some of the areas of our object? To do that, I'm just going to change a couple of settings. So let's reduce the weighting, and then let's paint the ears to start with. And the purpose here is not to be completely accurate. For the example, I just want to demonstrate how this is going to work when we have different weighted values on different areas of our object. So I'm going to just paint most of the other ear as well. And now I'm going to reduce the threshold value. As soon as I reduce it below 1, pretty much all of the red area of our object has now been hidden from view because the threshold value falls below the value of those vertices. Over time, you'll see gradually on the ears, more and more of the geometry disappearing, because there's a little bit of a fall off between the ears, which are a deep blue, and the head, which is a deep red. So as I reduce the threshold, more and more of that geometry is hidden until we reach a value close to the equivalent to what the weighting was used when we actually painted these ears. So once I hit a value of around 0.074, that's when all of this geometry is going to disappear, because none of that geometry is going to fall below the weight that I initially assigned. So again, let's bring everything back into view. Let's go with a higher weighting this time. And now I'm just going to paint the nose a bit. Let's go even higher. And we'll just paint the mouth area. And then I'm going to go higher still and just paint the center of the eyes. So now I have different models that have different weighted levels for my model. Now if we return to the threshold, click and drag, initially you'll again see that all of the areas that were just that deep red, they've disappeared. But now we have the ears, we've got the eyes, we've got the nose, we've got the mouth. As I lower the threshold, part by part, the eyes go first, then the mouth, then the nose, and finally the ears, based on the weighted values that I used when painting each area of the model. Let's take a look at another example. So here I've just got a mock-up of some random creature that I just decided to design in 5 minutes. And this sort of example should give you a little bit more of an idea as to how you can use the mask modifier on objects such as animals or creatures like this one. Now I've gone ahead of time and I've created a vertex group, which is just all of the vertices being part of the same group. So here I've got the mask modifier added. I can just click and select all, and now the all vertex group has been assigned to this object. Currently it's visible, but if I set this all the way to 1, then it's going to actually match the value of the weighted vertices and will be hidden from view. I can revert this by using the invert option, and now it's going to be visible when the threshold is set to 1, and below that it's going to be made invisible. You might see that there's a little bit of geometry here, and that's because I had applied some weight painting onto the model beforehand. But for now, we're just going to move into weight painting mode, where it's 99% red, and I'm just going to paint a little bit of the geometry by setting the weight value. I can also set the radius and strength values if I want to get the exact weighting that I'm looking for. For now, I'm just going to click and drag on my head in particular, and this should allow me the ability to hide either the head itself or the rest of the body so that I can work on the head without the rest of the body getting in the way. So once I've painted that, I'm going to lower my threshold, and as soon as I do, a lot of what was red then disappears. Don't forget, we've got this invert button ticked, so it's going to hide the red vertices, or at least the ones that appear red using weight painting, and then it's going to gradually hide other colors until it reaches blue. So it can hide more and more until it reaches the threshold value used over here for the initial weighting of the head. But if I invert this value, then the red areas of my object will remain in view until we hit a threshold value of 1. And then as I lower the threshold, more and more of the object becomes visible. You may notice, however, that there's a lot of jagged edges that are formed, and this is because when we typically use vertex groups with the mask modifier, it's going to try to remove entire faces and vertices and edges where possible. However, we can fix this to an extent by clicking on this smooth option right here. What this will do is it will use the vertex group's weights and it will cut off where it deems appropriate to maintain a smooth structure. So if I left click, you'll see exactly what I mean. So now it just looks like a little bit more of a uniform cut around the model at this point. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's a lot less jagged than when we had the smooth option turned off. Now, when using weight painting, if you're finding it a little bit cumbersome to paint around a more complex mesh, there are certain tools that you can use to simplify the process. For example, I'm just going to hide the creature. Let's bring in a different object. I need to be in object mode to do so. So maybe a torus object, for example. Move into weight paint mode. And if I just take a top orthographic view, I might use a tool such as gradient. This will allow me to click and drag and then define the areas which are going to be painted based on where I drag this line. So I can click and drag, reposition, and now if I was to apply the mask modifier to this object, I would have to ensure that I've got a vertex group which is actually created automatically when you use one of these tools. Select that vertex group, and then you can manipulate the threshold value to hide your geometry based on the influence. We can also re-demonstrate this with a slightly more complicated object, so I'm just going to delete the torus. And let's use Suzanne again. Also, I'm just going to increase the number of subdivisions. So here's going to be an example where we are combining modifiers together. Let's take a look at it through the front orthographic view. Move into weight painting. And this time, perhaps I want to go along the Z axis for my gradient. So click and drag. I'll go as high as I need to. So maybe about here. And then we're just going to add that mask modifier. Set it to group. Again, this is going to be automatically created if you use a tool like gradient to define the weighting. And then manipulate the threshold, and over time, the object will smooth out of existence. And of course, you can use that smooth option to just improve the way in which your object gradually disappears from the viewport. Now, along with many other modifiers, including subdivision surface, you can actually animate the effects of the mask modifier, but this is one of the better modifiers to animate with, because it allows you to make an object disappear or reappear over time. To do that, we can define the threshold by clicking on this white dot right here. So it's currently set to 0. We're going to left click, and that's going to add a keyframe. I'm just going to bring this up. You can see we've added a keyframe at frame 1. And now I'm going to move to frame 120, increase the threshold to 1. And then I'm going to left click here where the diamond is positioned to create another keyframe. And actually, I'm just going to move this to about frame 100. And at frame 140, we're going to add another keyframe. Go to frame 240 and lower the threshold back to 0 and add one more keyframe. So here, if I go back to the start and press play, The modifier will gradually dissolve the model, and then the model will return. The effect of the mask modifier changes depending on the other modifiers that are applied in the stack. Here we have an example of a brick wall created from a single cube. This wall requires 3 versions of the array modifier. One for the initial row, a second for the row above it, and then a third array for each additional pair of rows going up along the z-axis. Now, a problem with using the mask modifier for an object like this lies in the ability to accurately weight paint all of the blocks. If we go to weight painting and use the gradient tool, for example, we can click and drag, but you will see that the effect of the weight painting tool is going to be mirrored on every single individual block. This isn't going to be what we would want if we needed to hide the blocks as a whole rather than just the corners of each block. So in this scenario, it would be better to actually apply our array modifiers so we can use the geometry of each block. We're going to move back into object mode, and then we would need to apply the array modifiers one by one. But before I do that, just so you can see exactly what I'm talking about, I'm going to very quickly use weight painting on this brick wall. Then I'm going to add my mask modifier, add the group, vertex group, and increase the threshold. Now here, eventually, we reach a point where all of the geometry dissolves. So it's not quite operating as it should. Now I'm going to use Ctrl-Z several times, and we're going to apply each of these modifiers. Select the model and press the Tab key, and now we should be able to select the geometry of each brick. This is where we'd go back into weight paint, click and drag with our gradient tool, and now we're getting a much better effect when it comes to being able to actually paint the weighting on our object. So we'll go to about here, we'll go back to object mode, add modifier, mask, choose the group, vertex group, and increase the threshold value. And as I do that, you'll see that one brick at a time, we're able to hide these bricks from our view. And that's done primarily based on the original location of the gradient, as well as the angle at which we were to create and draw that line when defining the actual weighting of the individual blocks. Now you can change this effect a little bit by adding the smooth parameter, and this is just going to follow the gradient itself more accurately rather than really caring about where the vertices are going to be attached to each other. So it creates almost a straight line coming down based on the angle of our gradient. But one thing to keep in mind when using vertex group masking in this way is if we pan our view, you should see that we have some non-manifold geometry created as a result of bringing our threshold to a specific point. And because we have so much geometry here, it's very difficult to avoid that. Just keep that in mind, as if you find the effect that you're looking for, you may then have to go in, apply the mask modifier, and remove some of the excess geometry that is created here. We're now going to turn our attention to the secondary method of using the mask modifier, and that is going to be with our armature. I'm starting off with a very simple example of a cylinder that I have created. I've scaled it down and I've added 2 loop cuts. The idea here is we're going to create an armature where each bone represents each of the 3 sections of our cylinder. We're going to move back into object mode and we're going to create an armature object. You might not be able to see your armature bone, so just turn on the X-ray toggle located in the top corner of the viewport. Then we're just going to reposition the bone, and we're also going to scale it down to about here. I'm going to select my cylinder just to make sure that I can line up the positioning as best as possible. Then we're just going to extrude a couple of times up to the top of the cylinder. So now that looks just about right for me. I've got my armature, I've got my cylinder. I'm now going to select the cylinder first, shift select the armature, use Control P, and then I'm going to choose with automatic weights. So I'm going to go left click, and it's going to assign or parent the cylinder to the armature object. So if I select the armature, hit the G key, it will move both the armature as well as the cylinder. The next step is going to be the ability to correctly assign those vertices to each of our bones. While we have assigned using automatic groups, this isn't always going to be the perfect result, and you may need to go in and assign groups manually. The most important thing here is correctly assigning the vertex groups. So we're going to go into our cylinder object. You can see we've got 3 vertex groups, 1 for each bone. The first vertex group will represent the bottom bone of our armature. We're going to go into edit mode for this, and then we're going to select the first vertex group. In this example, that looks correct. So let's then select the geometry for the bone.001 group. And here we might need to make a couple of changes. So I'm just going to select everything at the bottom and click on the remove button, deselect everything, select again, and that's what we're looking for. Then the last one is going to be the top bone. And again, we've got a bit of geometry that we wouldn't want to be a part of the top bone for this example. So we're just going to select the geometry that we want to remove, click remove, left click, select again. And now the geometry is correctly assigned to each of our bones. This is where we then move on to using the MASK Modifier. So for the moment, return to object mode, go to the Modifiers tab, and you'll see here that I actually have technically 2 armatures added to this model by mistake because of what I was doing earlier with this object. I'm just going to remove the first one because it's actually the second one that I'm using here. You're only going to have one, so you won't have to worry about it. And then we're going to add another modifier, which is going to be the MASK Modifier. We're going to set this to armature, and we're going to set the armature object to armature. And as soon as I do this, the entire model is going to disappear. Now this is going to be the case when you're in object mode, and if you increase or decrease the threshold, nothing's going to happen with this setup. But the real power here comes when you select your armature and then you move into pose mode. Select any of your bones and the geometry associated to that bone's vertex group will be made visible. This way, you can only make visible the geometry of the bone that you have selected. You can then manipulate that geometry specifically however you require in pose mode, so that you can get a much clearer view of what the geometry is doing when we manipulate that specific bone. Let's repeat the process, but this time we're going to use the slightly more complex Suzanne mesh. And this time I've subdivided it using the subdivision surface modifier, and we're just going to apply this modifier so that we have a lot of geometry to work with. Now I'm going to add in an armature mesh, and we'll just position this towards the bottom of Suzanne, pop into edit mode, G then C, and this can be the mouth area, E then Z, bring it up to the nose area, and then E then Z to bring it up to the top. From here, we're going to parent Suzanne to our new armature, which is armature.001. So make sure to select Suzanne first, then the armature second, Control P, armature deform with automatic weights. Then select Suzanne, go to the data tab properties to confirm that we have 3 vertex groups because we have 3 bones. Let's pop into edit mode for our object where we can see the geometry more clearly. Let's select for each bone and deselect just so we've got an idea as to what geometry is selected. And we may need to play about with these settings just a little bit. So here I'm going to select for the bone and remove everything, deselect. Let's take a look at our object from the front, click and drag the mouth area and then select assign. We're going to deselect, then move on to bone.001. Way too much is selected here, so we're just going to select everything and click remove. Then we're going to click and drag along the nose area. Maybe just go a little bit higher. And we're going to assign these vertices to bone.001. So now we can check for bone 001 and the original bone. And at the moment, there's some geometry here that's actually not going to be selected. So what I'm going to do as well is just click and drag down here, select assign, then select. So that looks good. Go back to the bone. That looks pretty good as well. Then finally, the top bone. We're going to remove all that geometry. Then we're going to come down to about the ear level, select, and assign. So at this point, the geometry should be accurate to which bone we want to apply it to. And now we're going to return to object mode, go to the Modifiers tab. You should see we've got the Armature Modifier added automatically. We're then going to add the MASK Modifier underneath, set to Armature, and set the Armature to .001. The object should disappear regardless of the threshold value. We're going to go into pose mode for our Armature.001 object. And if I select one of these bones, the geometry that is associated to the vertex group of that bone will become visible. So you can perform this type of workflow with just about any object that is connected to a armature so that you can preview the areas of the model based on the specific bone that those vertices are associated to. So that sums up how the mask modifier is designed to work with our objects. We can use it just to hide the entire object as a whole. We can use it to hide specifically defined vertex groups. We can use it to hide areas of our model based on a gradient. We can use it to mask and resurface our geometry as part of an animation. And we can even use it to connect to an armature so that when we work in post mode, we end up seeing only the geometry associated with a specific bone. There are, of course, going to be many other use cases for this tool, like all other tools, and over the coming weeks and months, we're going to be publishing many more videos on the different tools and modifiers that you can use in Blender. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell icon. Thanks for now, and I'll see you in the next video.